sometimes I was like, wow, this is an old book. I don't need to read an old book. I want to read a new book. But because you basically talk about in that book, that was, I think the right brain, left brain thing wasn't popular yet. I think your book partially made that a popular concept around thinking about the logical brain and then
Yeah.
the creative brain. Back then, that was 2006. Can you say something like why you got into that book?
I started noticing things in my own world. I started noticing people who, like a lot of these people who I called free agents, were working not in offices, but they were working in studios. I noticed that a lot of people who were in business had degrees in the arts. I had also just like the kind of the circumstance that we were talking about earlier. When I was in my 20s, I actually spent a great deal of time in India, and so I started um, following and even writing about some of the certainly U.S., mostly U.S., but other Western work being outsourced to India at a low cost back when that was a that was a big deal.
Mm.
And again, putting the pieces together, I thought there was something pretty significant going on here. And the more I looked at the research, the more I went out and did my reporting. We're going to India a couple of times for that book, and talking to executives at American companies and figuring out who was getting hired. I realized something very interesting was going on. That it was akin to what happened in the transition from the industrial economy to the information, the knowledge economy, where certain kinds of in the what it's all it goes back to your point about efficiency, that certain kinds of industrial processes can be done cheaper overseas and can be done faster by machines, and therefore you need fewer humans to do it, and those humans end up doing other kinds of things. They end up doing things like becoming search engine optimizers or massage therapists or other kinds of things, other kinds of jobs that we didn't have the words for 30 years ago. So the idea, the argument in that book, to put it very simply, is that in the information economy, the skills that mattered most were characteristic of the left hemisphere of the brain: logical, linear, sequential, analytical. Today, those abilities are still absolutely essential, but they're not enough, because those kinds of abilities can be automated very, very easily now, much more so than when I wrote the book. And so the abilities that matter the most are the abilities that are harder, not impossible, to automate and outsource, which end up being things like artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking. That those kinds of abilities have become the ones that are most important.
Mm-hmm. And they still are.
I agree. I agree. Now, I think what's interesting now, a change from all that, that long ago period, is that AI is able to do some of this right brain work.
Right.
So, and that's challenging. That's not something that I expected when I wrote that book.
Yeah, right. Even the right brain work. Exactly.
It can
And
do
then
a lot of it and
right.
reasonably well,
Exactly.
better than I would have forecast. And
Yeah.
so I think so. Another way to think about that is that what the workers of the future, again, whether in China or here, or Japan or China or in the States, um, we human beings are going to have to do work that supplements machine intelligence, doesn't compete with intelligence, but that adds to machine intelligence, that augments machine intelligence, that complements machine intelligence. And I do think that it ends up being a lot of these right brain things, which is a kind of like judgment and taste, and an aesthetic sense, and those kinds of things that are difficult to automate in that left brain way, and difficult for, at least for now, ChatGPT and these other large language models to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it impact you as a writer?
Um, I mean, I use these large language models to supplement some things that I do. So, for instance, I'll do I don't find it right now threatening. I don't think it's going to put me out of business, but maybe it will. The right now I use them, for instance, like I write an email newsletter, and so what I'll sometimes do is put the text of the email newsletter into ChatGPT or Claude and ask it to come up with, say, 10 subject lines that they
Mm,
thought might be good. And then
mm,
I'll choose or revise one of those 10 subject lines. So what it's doing is it's generating possibilities, But this is what I was saying before. The final judgment is mine, and it depends on my having the taste to know what's good and what's not. And what typically happens is they'll generate 10 subject lines. 9 will be awful.
Mm.
1 will be pretty good, and I'll look at it and use that as a starting point, and then make some edits and tweaks on that. So that's very helpful. One of the other things, the way that I use it, you mentioned all the research that I do. Right now, they actually are. Some of these large language models are pretty good at summarizing long papers. And what that does is that offers a screen for me about which papers I need to read fully and which papers I can just basically get the gist of. So that potentially saves me a huge amount of time.
Yeah. No, because I was thinking about that too when I was reading your old book and then thinking about this conversation today. My sense is that as you said, I think AI in your capacity or career, it can be more a supplementary tool for you. And because what part of a good author or writer in your sense, that's unique, I think is the curation part we talked about. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great. I mean, what you're calling. I mean, I think we're searching for how to describe this, and in general in society, and you and I in this conversation, curation is a good word for what you're talking about. I keep coming back to the word in English, at least. I have no idea what the Chinese translation is. The word for taste, like you have to know what's good and what's not, and that's something that I think develops over time. I tend to think that in certain domains, I have pretty good taste. But that's something that I have developed over many, many years. And so I think that taste and judgment and curation, I think it's a really good word here too. Those kinds of skills end up being really important. I think a challenge here is that how does one proceed through a work life or through an education to develop that? A reason I developed taste is because I spent some time doing inelegant grunt work. One way to help being a scientist is to be in some ways an apprentice scientist, to work as a research coordinator or as the assistant to a top researcher. And then you learn what is research, how do experiments work, how do I ask the right questions, how do I evaluate results, how do I respond to setbacks? And in doing that, you begin to do your own experiments and then begin to have the taste. So I think what concerns me a little bit is in the world of AI is that kind of low-level apprenticeship that many of us have gone through no longer exists because the AI can do a lot of that kind of grunt work.
Yeah. Well, that's a remarkable statement. People underestimate how useful those is.
Yeah. There might be a replacement for that. I don't want to glorify those kinds of jobs, but I do think that they serve a purpose in developing mastery. They serve in knowing what a profession is, in understanding how it all works, and ultimately being able to do your own work. So a lot of again, if you think about writing or art or science, at the early stages, a lot of it is imitative. That is, artists, I'm going to paint like that person, like she's painting over there. I'm a young scientist. I'm going to do the kind of research my mentor is doing. I'm a writer. I'm going to write like this person over here. And you do that and you begin to develop that and you say, oh, you know what? I actually have my own approach to doing things. I have my own voice. I have my own perspective. I have my own questions. And over time, you develop that. And I think that's how taste and judgment develop. It takes some time. And without those apprenticeships at the front end, I think we need alternative ways for people to develop those skills. And ultimately, what I keep coming back to, this word taste.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Because I think all the choice of stories and also the choice of words you use to describe those stories are just right on.
Thanks.
But this conversation we just had, I think it's there's so many gems in it. So I want to pause for a little bit to help our audience unpack. Because you first mentioned there are a few things that you talk about taste, you talk about aesthetics, you talk about sort of a sense, right, a judgment. Yeah. And I remember that was a famous educator. I'm sure there's a Western equivalent of that too. And talk about what is education, because education is what's left after you forget about everything. All the knowledge learned in school.
Right. That's a good line. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that is basically that's taste. Like I didn't know
Yeah.
what, how which algebra, problem I solved. I probably can solve it again if I, brush up a bit on it. But that doesn't mean I've lost my education. So like it's really, really forgetting about all those things. I think what's left is taste. So
Yeah,
that's
that's a
the
great point.
way,
Yeah, it's a good way to put. That's a good way to
right?
look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically what's left. And then the second thing you mentioned is around this moderate. I think it's the appropriate amount of groundwork. The
Yeah.
reason I say that is because, as I mentioned to you, I'm in Japan, so I'm here as a visiting scholar, so I'm observing Japan as an outsider. And one thing I'm kind of critical of Japan is how long they put their young people through this apprentice. It can
Yeah.
be like 3 years. Like, so basically, once you enter a big Japanese major corporation, you're there for life. And so everything is based on age and years. I think that's really suffocating education,
I
but
agree.
on career or innovation, sorry, suffocating innovation. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean the other end is good. Okay, let's put all the young people given the task to go to the moon. You don't go to the moon. You don't even know how to build a basic, mechanics. How do you talk about go to a moon? So there is a sort of appropriate level of groundwork. So it can be too long, it can be 30 years, but it also cannot be 3 days. So,
Right.
and then, yeah, when you talk about, I remember myself as well, because I got my PhD, and like the first year, I was like, rinsing flasks, and that's what you do. And you have to figure out your way around the lab. You don't contaminate things, right?
Right.
And how do you write your first draft of a paper? And my first draft is trash.
Right.
And
Right.
then, right, you have to go through that. And then I went to McKinsey, later on I became a partner. But the first, again, year and a half is all about, basic skill making PowerPoint, basic skill
Exactly.
making Excel sheets, right? And making sure there's no mistakes in your data. But that's the thing. And then, as you said, when you were talking, it reminds me that was how I developed my own sense of taste for that line of work. And then that's actually essential. And then you talk about your work too in doing speech writing. I'm sure there are many drafts that you have to go through to
Always.
get to a usable, right?
Always. I mean,
Yeah,
even now in the work that I do, there are multiple drafts. But again, earlier in my life, I had to understand what is a draft. How do I
yeah,
know that the draft isn't right? How do I know when it is right? How do I know which criticism to take? How do I know which criticism to ignore? That is
right.
how people develop. That's how people learn in a profession. And so, again, I don't want to glorify that grunt work, but there is a value in it. And I think the interesting question is going to be how do we don't necessarily have to maintain that exact way of doing things, but I do think we need something to give people that foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.